With her final $2,200 clutched in shaking hands and an eviction notice burning in her jacket pocket, Sarah Mitchell watched in stunned disbelief as the contractor's crowbar split apart the rotting floorboards of the forgotten barn she had desperately bought at a sheriff's auction. Beneath the decaying timber lay the entrance to a stone-walled tunnel, its walls carved from solid rock and leading to a hidden chamber containing 4 iron-bound chests filled with gold nuggets. Weathered banknotes estimated at $2 million. The lost treasure of infamous bandit Blackjack Donovan, whose gang had terrorized the Colorado Territory in the 1870s, a discovery that would transform her fight for survival into an incredible second chance at life. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable journey, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story inspires you, hit that subscribe button, because we have more incredible true stories coming your way. The merciless Colorado sun blazed through the jagged holes in what had once been the proud windows of the Donovan barn. Casting harsh shadows across the building, inspectors report that Sarah Mitchell had spread across the remnants of a weathered workbench. The pages fluttered slightly in the hot breeze that carried the scent of dry prairie grass and distant pine forests from the Rocky Mountain foothills. At 35, Sarah's face bore the unmistakable marks of a woman who had endured 18 months of relentless adversity. Deep worry lines carved parentheses around her once bright green eyes, while premature streaks of silver threaded through auburn hair that she now kept pulled back in a practical ponytail. Despite the bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to radiate from her slender frame, her jaw still held the stubborn determination that had become her most reliable companion during these dark days. "The entire roof structure is compromised," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she traced her finger along the red-marked sections of the damage assessment. The inspector's clinical language couldn't disguise the building's dire condition. "And look at this section. Here the foundation has shifted significantly along the entire east wall. The supports are pulling away from the main structure." Jake Morrison, the contractor she had somehow managed to convince to examine the property despite her obviously limited financial resources, leaned his weathered frame against the doorway and studied the architectural drawings with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too many historic buildings reach this critical juncture. At 42, his sun-weathered face bore the deep creases and permanent squint lines earned from 2 decades of restoring historic structures throughout Jefferson County. His hands permanently stained with wood, preservative and calloused from countless hours wielding restoration tools, held the building plans with a reverence that spoke to his genuine passion for preserving Colorado's frontier heritage. "Sarah, I need to be straight with you," Jake said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone that came from years of working in dusty, debris-filled spaces. "The support beams in the upper loft aren't just damaged, they're completely rotted through. In several critical areas, that's not cosmetic damage we're talking about. That's structural failure waiting to happen." He paused, studying her face with the careful attention of someone who had delivered too much bad news to desperate property owners. "The water damage from years of neglect has compromised the building's basic integrity. Honestly, renovation costs on a structure this far gone could easily exceed what you paid for the entire property." The sound of country music drifted through the barn's damaged walls from Jake's portable radio, the tinny speakers barely audible over the creaking of stressed timber. The local DJ's voice carried the cheerful enthusiasm that small-town radio personalities used to mask the economic struggles facing rural Colorado communities. Don't forget, Folks Millfield's annual Pioneer Day celebration kicks off next Friday. Mayor Henderson promises this year's Wild West reenactment will feature the biggest treasure hunt in county history, celebrating our legendary outlaw heritage. And remember, the Historical Society is still looking for volunteers to help with the Blackjack Donovan exhibition. The once magnificent interior of the Donovan barn stretched out before them like a monument to decay and lost dreams. What had been, according to historical photographs Sarah had found in the county archives. A showpiece of 1870s frontier construction now stood as a testament to neglect and the relentless passage of time. The original wide plank flooring, hand-hewn from massive ponderosa pines that had grown in these mountains for centuries before being felled by territorial settlers, now sagged ominously in several places. Water stains spread across the walls like abstract paintings, marking where decades of winter storms had found their way through damaged roofing and failed window seals. A vintage leather harness rack, its iron hooks green with verdigris and half of them missing entirely, hung at a precarious angle from what had once been a sturdy support beam. Decades of dust had settled on its surfaces like a gray shroud, obscuring the careful craftsmanship that had once made it a source of pride for the barn's original owner. Today it stood as a silent witness to Sarah's desperate gamble, a last-ditch attempt to salvage some kind of future from the wreckage of her former life. The barn's history was intertwined with the legendary Outlaw whose name it bore. Built in 1874 by Thomas Donovan, Blackjack's law-abiding younger brother. The structure had served as both a working ranch facility and, according to local legends, that had persisted for nearly 150 years, secret hideout for one of Colorado Territory's most notorious criminal gangs. Thomas had maintained his respectability as a cattle rancher and hay supplier, while secretly providing sanctuary for his outlaw brother during the height of the territorial law. Enforcement crackdowns following the Great Mint robbery of 1873. Rebecca Torres emerged from the barn's back storage area, her practical work clothes now thoroughly coated with the fine dust that seemed to permeate every corner of the deteriorating structure. At 34, Rebecca's nonsense approach to life was evident in everything from her efficient movements to the practical ponytail that kept her dark hair out of her way while she worked. Her friendship with Sarah dated back to their college days. At Colorado State University, where they had bonded over late-night study sessions and shared dreams of careers that would make a difference in their communities. Now, 15 years later, Rebecca found herself using her background in historic preservation to help her best friend navigate what might be the most important decision of her life. "The electrical system is completely beyond repair," Rebecca reported, gratefully accepting the water bottle Sarah offered from the small cooler they had brought. The July heat was becoming oppressive inside the barn, with no functioning ventilation to provide relief. I'm talking about Nobin tube wiring. That should have been replaced in the 1940s, and most of it has been damaged by rodents or moisture. Starting over would actually be cheaper than trying to repair what's here. She paused, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. And there's extensive termite damage along the entire south wall. Those antique farming implements. You were excited about the hand-forged plows and wooden-handled tools that convinced you to bid on this place. I'm afraid most of them might be too damaged to restore. Sarah felt her heart sink as another piece of her carefully constructed plan crumbled away. The vintage farming equipment, with its connections to Colorado's agricultural heritage, had represented one of the few potentially valuable assets that came with the property. In her optimistic moments during the auction, she had envisioned restoring those tools as part of a small museum or educational display. It might help generate some income from the barn's historical significance. Now, even that modest hope seemed to be slipping away, joining the growing list of complications that threatened to transform her investment from a desperate gamble into a financial catastrophe. Sarah moved to the barn's front window, or rather to the space where a window had once provided a view of Millfield's main street. The glass was long gone, leaving only the weathered wooden frame and a clear view of the small Colorado town that had become her unlikely new home. Millfield had seen better days. During the silver mining boom of the 1870s and 1880s, the town had been a bustling hub of commerce and activity, with miners, ranchers, and merchants creating a thriving community in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. Historic photographs in the local library showed a main street lined with prosperous businesses, horse-drawn wagons loaded with precious metals heading to the railroad depot, and the kind of optimistic energy that had defined the American frontier experience. Those days were long gone. Now Millfield struggled against the same economic forces that had hollowed out small towns across rural America. Chain stores and suburban development had drawn business away from the historic downtown, leaving behind a collection of empty storefronts and struggling local businesses. The mayor's talk of Pioneer Day celebrations and treasure hunts represented desperate attempts to attract tourist dollars to a community that had lost much of its economic foundation. The Donovan barn itself had been deteriorating for the better part of a decade. Ever since the death of Eleanor Hartman, the elderly woman who had inherited the property from her grandfather and maintained it as a private museum of sorts. Eleanor had been something of a local character, a retired schoolteacher, would spend her weekends researching the barn's history and giving informal tours to curious visitors. When she passed away at 89, her heirs had neither the interest nor the financial resources to maintain the property, and it had sat empty for 8 years while legal complications prevented its sale. The sheriff's auction where Sarah had acquired the barn had been sparsely attended, reflecting both the property's obvious condition problems and the limited number of people willing to take on such a massive restoration project. The winning bid of $18,500 had seemed like a bargain at the time, representing the last of Sarah's financial resources after her devastating divorce settlement had been consumed by legal fees and creditor demands. That divorce had been the beginning of Sarah's downward spiral. What had started as a typical marriage dissolution had become a financial nightmare when her ex-husband's gambling addiction came to light during the legal proceedings. David had been hiding his problems for years, using credit cards, home equity loans, and even Sarah's savings account to fund his increasingly desperate attempts to win back his losses. By the time the truth emerged, their comfortable middle class life had been built on a foundation of debt that threatened to consume everything they had worked to build. The legal battle that followed had been brutal and expensive. David's addiction had made him unreliable and combative, forcing Sarah to spend thousands of dollars on attorneys just to protect her basic interests, the house they had shared for 8 years had been sold to pay creditors, leaving Sarah with a settlement that should have provided temporary security but instead barely covered the legal fees and outstanding debts that had accumulated during the marriage. "The Martinez ranch sold last month?" Rebecca said quietly, interrupting Sarah's brooding contemplation of her circumstances. She was sweeping dust from a corner shelf with mechanical efficiency, her movements betraying the nervous energy that came from watching her best friend take what seemed like an increasingly risky gamble. That development company from Denver bought the whole 300-acre spread. They're breaking ground on a shopping center and housing development next month.
Eight.
Jake's expression darkened at this news, his jaw tightening with the anger that came from watching Colorado's historic landscape disappear beneath waves of generic commercial development. "Vultures have been circling every historic property in Jefferson County for the past 5 years, he said, his voice carrying a bitterness earned from watching too many irreplaceable structures get bulldozed for parking lots and strip malls. They're systematically tearing down a century and a half of our state's history, placing it with the same corporate garbage you can find in any suburb from here to Florida." The pattern was painfully familiar to anyone who cared about preserving Colorado's unique heritage. Historic ranches, mining structures, and frontier-era buildings were vanishing at an alarming rate. Victims of development pressures and the simple economics of maintaining old buildings in a modern economy, each demolished structure represented not just lost architecture, but lost connections to the stories and experiences that had shaped the American West. The Donovan barn was one of the last intact examples of 1870s frontier construction remaining. In Jefferson County, a distinction that carried enormous historical significance but very little financial value in a real estate. It's a market that valued square footage over heritage. The building's connections to Blackjack Donovan's legendary exploits added another layer of historical importance, but also attracted the kind of treasure hunters and curiosity seekers who had contributed to the property's deterioration over the years. Sunrise Development called again yesterday morning, Rebecca admitted reluctantly, her voice carrying the tone of someone delivering news she knew her friend didn't want to hear. "They offered to relieve you of this financial burden, for the repair costs completely bankrupt. Those were their exact words. Pretty compassionate, right?" "Let me guess," Sarah said with bitter resignation, not bothering to look away from the window. 40 cents on the dollar? Just enough to cover what I paid at the auction. But nothing for the historical significance or the potential value of a properly restored property." 35 cents, actually, Rebecca replied. "They seemed to think they were being generous." The unspoken reality of Sarah's situation hung in the dusty air like a physical presence. The Donovan barn wasn't just a risky real estate investment, it had become her entire future, the repository of every hope she had for rebuilding her shattered life. for any remaining dollar from her divorce settlement after the lawyers and creditors had claimed their shares had gone into purchasing this crumbling structure. The plan, such as it was, involved somehow restoring the barn sufficiently to convert it into some kind of income-generating property, maybe a venue for weddings and events or a historical attraction that could capitalize on the area's frontier heritage. But if she lost the barn to financial reality, she would lose everything. Her investment, her housing plans for herself and 7-year-old Emma, and her last realistic hope of achieving some kind of financial stability. The eviction notice from her current landlord had given her 30 days to vacate the small apartment she had been renting since the divorce. That deadline was now just 2 weeks away, and she still had no clear plan for where she and Emma would live if the barn project failed. The weight of responsibility for her daughter's welfare added another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation. Emma had already endured the trauma of her parents' divorce and the subsequent financial instability that had forced them to move 3 times in 18 months. The little girl deserved better than a mother who seemed to career from one crisis to the next, making increasingly desperate decisions in an attempt to create some semblance of security. "I need to examine that storage room floor myself," Sarah said finally, reaching for the work gloves that hung from a nail beside the door. The gloves had been a practical purchase during her first visit to the property, when she had still believed that hard work and determination might be enough to overcome the barn's obvious problems. "Maybe we can salvage some of the original wide plank flooring for use in other parts of the restoration? Those boards were cut from old-growth timber. They don't make lumber like that anymore." "Absolutely not alone," Jake insisted, setting down the building plans and reaching for his toolbox. The wooden box had been his constant companion for 2 decades of restoration work, scarred surface bearing witness to countless projects that had transformed derelict buildings into showcases of historical preservation. Those old floors can be treacherous, especially in a structure that's been compromised by water damage and settling. "This building has already extracted enough of a price from UI. Won't have you getting hurt because we skipped basic safety precautions." Sarah looked at him with genuine gratitude, moved by his continued willingness to help despite the increasingly obvious reality that she might not be able to pay him for all the work he was doing. "Jake, you've already done far more than I'm paying you for. I can't keep asking you to." Jake held up a weathered hand, cutting off her protest with the gentle authority of someone who had navigated similar conversations many times before. "Sarah, you hired me to provide a complete structural assessment of this property, and that's exactly what I intend to deliver. I don't build a professional reputation by walking away when things get complicated or challenging." He picked up his toolbox and moved toward the storage room, pausing at the doorway to look back at her with a slight smile. "Besides, I've been restoring historic buildings for 20 years now. I didn't get into this line of work by playing it safe or taking the easy path. Buildings like this, they're worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible," as they prepared to make their way into the barn's storage room for a more thorough examination. The radio's tinny speakers crackled with another local announcement. "This is KMFL, or Voice in the Rockies, with breaking news from the Jefferson County Historical Society. They've just announced a special summer exhibition focusing on the lost treasure of the infamous outlaw Blackjack Donovan, featuring newly discovered journal entries and letters from the 1870s that shed new light on the Great Mint robbery and its aftermath. Local historians continue to debate whether the legendary Donovan fortune actually exists, but the mystery has been bringing treasure hunters and history buffs to our beautiful Colorado mountains for generations." Sarah and Jake exchanged curious glances, both of them struck by the timing of this announcement. The outlaw history of Millfield and the surrounding Jefferson County area had been a source of local fascination and pride for nearly 150 years, with Blackjack Donovan's exploits during the tumultuous territorial period serving as the region's primary claim to fame and its most reliable tourist attraction. "You know, every kid who grows up in Millfield learns the Blackjack Donovan stories," Sarah said, momentarily distracted from her financial worries by the connection between the radio announcement and the barn they were about to explore. "It's been the town's biggest legend for over a century, the idea that somewhere in these mountains there's still a fortune in gold and silver hidden away from the Great Mint robbery." Jake nodded, his expression reflecting the fond familiarity of someone who had grown up with the same local legends. I spent my childhood summers exploring every cave and abandoned mine shaft in these mountains, convinced I was going to be the one to finally find Donovan's treasure. He chuckled at the memory, but his expression grew more serious as he continued. Last year, I restored the original windows at the Pioneer Museum downtown. The curator told me they get visitors from all over the country, history buffs, treasure hunters, genealogy researchers, all drawn by the Donovan story. That legend has kept this town on the map when a lot of other places like it just faded away completely. Rebecca handed them each a heavy-duty flashlight from the emergency kit she kept in her vehicle, her eyes reflecting the concern and affection she felt for her friend, but wouldn't voice directly. "Just be extra careful in there, both of you," she said, her voice carrying the practical worry of someone who had seen too many restoration projects go wrong. That delivery truck that clipped the power line outside last week when the driver was texting, that impact loosened some of the support posts along this side of the building. The whole structure is more unstable than it was even a month ago. She paused, glancing around the deteriorating interior with professional assessment. And there's probably broken glass scattered around from when those teenagers broke in last spring and vandalized the place. The sheriff said they were looking for anything valuable they could steal and sell. As they prepared to step into the barn's storage room, the oppressive July heat seemed to intensify in the enclosed space. Shafts of sunlight streamed through the dust-covered windows, illuminating dancing particles that had been disturbed by their movement and creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that made the barn's decay seem somehow romantic rather than merely sad. The interplay of light and shadow revealed details of craftsmanship that had survived. Despite decades of neglect, hand-carved beam joints, mortise and tenon connections that had been fitted with the precision of master carpenters' iron hardware that had been forged by blacksmiths whose skills had died out generations ago. Neither Sarah Mitchell nor Jake Morrison could have possibly imagined that the next few minutes would forever change not only the future of the crumbling,
Donovan barn,
but also the trajectory of Sarah's desperate attempt to rebuild her life from the ashes of financial ruin. They had no way of knowing that their practical decision to examine the storage room's damaged flooring would uncover secrets that had been waiting patiently in the darkness for nearly 150 years, or that Sarah's last-ditch gamble with her remaining 2,200 would soon reveal treasures beyond anything her most optimistic dreams had dared to envision. The ancient iron hinges protested with a sound like grinding bones as Sarah pushed open the warped wooden door to the storage room, Jake following close behind her with his powerful LED flashlight cutting through the accumulated shadows of decades. The air that greeted them was thicker and more stagnant than in the main barn, carrying not just the expected scents of old wood and unwelcome moisture, but something else, something that hinted at mysteries yet to be discovered in the darkness that lay ahead. The storage room stretched before them like a forgotten tomb, far larger than Sarah had expected from her previous cursory inspections of the property. The space extended deep into what had once been the barn's eastern wing, its dimensions obscured by years of accumulated debris, abandoned equipment, and the kind of organized chaos that suggested multiple generations of owners had used it as a catch-all for items too valuable to discard, but too broken to repair. Jake's LED flashlight beam swept across the room methodically, revealing a space that told the story of the barn's long decline. Newer construction materials, plywood sheets, metal shelving units, and concrete blocks had been added sometime in the 1960s or 1970s, creating awkward divisions within what had originally been a single large room. These later additions clashed jarringly with the original stone foundation walls and massive timber supports, creating a visual timeline of the property's various owners and their different approaches to maintaining the historic structure. Previous owner definitely attempted some kind of renovation back here, Jake observed, running his free hand along a section of metal shelving that had been bolted directly into the original stone wall. His voice carried the professional assessment of someone who had seen countless historic properties subjected to well-intentioned but misguided modifications. These shelves aren't original to the building, I'd guess. They were added maybe 50 or 60 years ago. It's probably when someone tried to convert part of the barn into workshop space. Sarah's flashlight joined his, creating overlapping circles of illumination that revealed the storage room's true scope. The space was much more substantial than she had realized during her initial walkthrough of the property, stretching toward the back wall of the structure where the original builders had constructed what appeared to be a separate foundation system. Some sections featured the newer construction Jake had identified, while other areas revealed the barn's original character: hand-cut stone foundations that had been laid with the precision of master masons, timber supports hewn from trees that had grown in these mountains for centuries before being felled by territorial settlers. What immediately caught their attention, however, was the condition of the flooring. Several wide plank boards were visibly damaged, warping upward in a pattern that suggested they had been pushed from below by some kind of structural movement. The wood showed the telltale signs of chronic moisture problems: dark staining, soft spots that would likely crumble under pressure. It was the kind of dimensional instability that came from repeated cycles of expansion and contraction. Main water damage seems to be concentrated in this area, Jake said, directing his flashlight toward the far corner where several floorboards had rotted away completely, leaving gaps that revealed the darkness beneath. Could be foundations settling. Not unusual in a structure this old, especially with poor drainage and decades of deferred maintenance. He knelt down to examine the damaged area more closely, his experienced eye cataloging the various factors that had contributed to the deterioration: groundwater, roof leaks, probably some rodent damage over the years. The wood has been subjected to more moisture than it was designed to handle. The portable dehumidifier that Sarah had hastily purchased and installed during her previous visit was laboring against the ambient humidity, its collection tank already approaching capacity. You know, every kid who grows up in Millfield learns the Blackjack Donovan stories, Sarah said, momentarily distracted from her financial worries by the connection between the radio announcement and the barn they were about to explore. It's been the town's biggest legend for over a century, the idea that somewhere in these mountains there's still a fortune in gold and silver hidden away from the Great Mint robbery. Jake nodded, his expression reflecting the fond familiarity of someone who had grown up with the same local legends. I spent my childhood summers exploring every cave and abandoned mine shaft in these mountains, convinced I was going to be the one to finally find Donovan's treasure. He chuckled at the memory, but his expression grew more serious as he continued. Last year, I restored the original windows at the Pioneer Museum downtown. The curator told me they get visitors from all over the country, history buffs, treasure hunters, genealogy researchers, all drawn by the Donovan story. That legend has kept this town on the map when a lot of other places like it just faded away completely. Rebecca handed them each a heavy-duty flashlight from the emergency kit she kept in her vehicle, her eyes reflecting the concern and affection she felt for her friend, but wouldn't voice directly. "Just be extra careful in there, both of you," she said, her voice carrying the practical worry of someone who had seen too many restoration projects go wrong. That delivery truck that clipped the power line outside last week when the driver was texting, that impact loosened some of the support posts along this side of the building. The whole structure is more unstable than it was even a month ago. She paused, glancing around the deteriorating interior.
Sarah appreciated his evident respect for the property's historical significance. In Jake Morrison, she had found not just a contractor, but someone who understood the cultural value of what she was trying to preserve. During the weeks since, she had purchased the Donovan barn. Most people had regarded her decision as either foolishly romantic or financially suicidal, and quite possibly both. Family members, former colleagues, even well-meaning friends had questioned her judgment, suggesting that she was allowing desperation to cloud her business sense. But Jake saw something different. He understood that buildings like the Donovan barn represented irreplaceable connections to Colorado's frontier heritage, physical embodiments of the stories and experiences that had shaped the American West. His willingness to work with her despite her obvious financial limitations reflected not just professional courtesy, but a genuine commitment to historic preservation that went beyond mere commercial considerations. As they continued their systematic examination of the storage room, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Just 18 months earlier, she had been living what most people would consider a comfortable, middle-class life. She had owned a modest but well-maintained home in suburban Denver, worked as an educational coordinator for the state park system, and enjoyed the kind of financial security that allowed for vacation planning, retirement savings, and the occasional splurge on home improvements or family activities. The collapse of her marriage had shattered that stability with devastating completeness. David's gambling addiction, hidden from her for years through increasingly elaborate deceptions, had consumed not just their savings, but had created a web of debt that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. Credit cards, home equity loans, even forged checks drawn on accounts Sarah hadn't known were overdrawn. The full extent of the financial damage had only become clear during the divorce proceedings, when court-ordered financial disclosure had revealed the true scope of the disaster. The legal battle that followed had been both emotionally devastating and financially ruinous. David's addiction had made him unpredictable and combative, forcing Sarah to hire expensive attorneys just to protect her most basic interests. The house they had shared for 8 years had ultimately been sold to pay creditors, leaving Sarah with a settlement that should have provided temporary security, but instead barely covered the legal fees and outstanding debts that had accumulated. During the marriage, the most painful aspect of the entire experience had been watching how it affected Emma. At 7 years old, her daughter was old enough to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with their family situation, but too young to comprehend the complex financial and legal issues that were reshaping their lives. Emma had handled the divorce itself with remarkable resilience, but the subsequent moves, first to a small apartment, then to an even smaller one when Sarah lost her state job due to budget cuts, and now to temporary housing while they waited to see if the barn project would provide some kind of solution, had taken a visible toll on the little girl's sense of security. The responsibility Sarah felt for Emma's welfare added immense pressure to every decision she made. Her daughter deserved better than a mother who seemed to careen from one crisis to the next, making increasingly desperate choices in an attempt to create some semblance of stability. But at the same time, Sarah knew that taking risks was the only way she could realistically hope to rebuild their lives. Conservative choices might feel safer, but they also offered no real path toward the kind of financial recovery that would allow her to provide Emma with the security and opportunities she deserved. "Sarah, come look at this," Jake called from the eastern corner of the storage room, his voice carrying a note of professional curiosity that made her abandon her brooding contemplation of their circumstances. She picked her way carefully across the uneven flooring, noting how her footsteps seemed to echo strangely in this part of the room, as if the space beneath the floor was larger than it should be. When she reached Jake's position, she could see what had captured his attention. A section of flooring that appeared subtly different from the surrounding wood, not just in terms of condition, but in the actual construction technique. The boards in this area ran perpendicular to the surrounding planking, creating a rectangular pattern that was approximately 4 feet across and maybe 6 feet long. Unlike the water-damaged sections they had been examining elsewhere in the room, these boards appeared to have been deliberately arranged in this configuration. "Different wood species," Jake said thoughtfully, kneeling down to examine the unusual section more closely. His flashlight revealed grain patterns and coloration that clearly distinguished these boards from the surrounding floor. "And look here," he directed his beam toward the edges of the rectangular section, where careful examination revealed small gaps between the boards and the surrounding flooring. "The construction technique is completely different. These boards aren't nailed down like the rest of the floor. They're sitting on some kind of framework underneath." Sarah knelt beside him, her own flashlight adding to the illumination as they studied what was clearly an intentional design feature rather than random damage or decay. Her heart began to beat faster as she recognized the implications of what they were seeing. "There's something underneath," she said, excitement momentarily overriding her concerns about the building's overall condition. This looks like it might be some kind of access panel, maybe a trap door or concealed storage space. Jake nodded, his decades of restoration experience having taught him that old buildings often contained hidden features that reflected the specific needs and concerns of their original occupants. Could be a root cellar, he mused, or maybe something from the Prohibition era. A lot of rural properties in Colorado have hidden spaces that were used for storing alcohol during the 1920s. He placed his hand against the unusual section of flooring and pressed experimentally at different points, testing the board's response to pressure. To their mutual surprise, the entire rectangular section shifted slightly under Jake's careful pressure, moving as a single unit rather than as individual boards. The movement was minimal, maybe half an inch, but it clearly indicated that the flooring in this area was designed to be removable. The discovery sent a surge of excitement through both of them, temporarily pushing aside their concerns about renovation costs and structural problems. Definitely a concealed access panel, Jake breathed, his professional excitement evident in his voice as he realized they had stumbled upon exactly the kind of historical feature that made restoration work genuinely thrilling. I've seen similar construction in other frontier-era buildings, but this is unusually sophisticated. Someone put serious thought and craftsmanship into creating this hidden access. Jake quickly retrieved a crowbar from his toolbox, the same tool that would later become famous as the instrument of their incredible discovery. The crowbar was a practical, well-used implement that had served him faithfully through countless restoration projects, its steel surface bearing the scratches and wear marks that came from years of prying apart reluctant building materials. He positioned it carefully at the edge of the removable section, taking care not to damage the surrounding flooring or the concealed panel itself. "Let me do this slowly and carefully," he said, applying gentle pressure to lift the edge of what they now knew was a deliberately constructed access cover. "If this is some kind of historical feature, we don't want to damage it by being too aggressive." With a grinding sound of wood moving against wood, a sound that seemed to echo strangely in the storage room's confined space, the rectangular section began to give way. As Jake continued to work the crowbar along the edges of the concealed panel, the entire section gradually lifted away from its supporting framework, revealing not a simple storage space or root cellar, but what appeared to be the entrance to a carefully constructed underground passage. Their flashlight beams penetrated the opening to reveal stone steps leading downward into darkness, carved directly into the living rock beneath the barn's foundation. The passage appeared to be approximately 4 feet wide, just large enough for a person to move through comfortably, and its walls were lined with carefully fitted stones that demonstrated the same level of craftsmanship they had admired in the barn's foundation work.
"That's not just a storage cellar," Jake stated unnecessarily, his voice carrying a mixture of professional admiration and genuine awe as their lights revealed the scope of the construction project that lay hidden beneath the barn floor. "That's a deliberate tunnel built with the same attention to detail and structural integrity as the barn itself." Sarah carefully directed her flashlight beam into the opening, trying to gauge the passage's depth and direction. The stone steps appeared to be hand-carved, each one carefully shaped to provide secure footing for someone moving between the barn and whatever lay at the tunnel's destination. The stonework was remarkably well preserved, showing little sign of the moisture damage that had affected the wooden structures above ground. "Frontier rear construction," Jake observed, examining the tunnel entrance without actually entering the passage. His experienced eye cataloged the construction techniques and materials that had been used. Hand-cut stone, probably local granite, from the mountain quarries that supplied building material throughout Jefferson County during the territorial period. This kind of work represents months of careful excavation and masonry, definitely not something that was thrown together quickly or casually. The implications of their discovery were beginning to sink in. This wasn't simply an old building with some interesting historical features. They had uncovered evidence of deliberate, sophisticated construction that suggested the Donovan barn had served purposes beyond simple agricultural storage. The tunnel's existence lent credibility to the local legends about Blackjack Donovan's use of the property as a hideout and raised intriguing questions about what might lie at the passage's destination. "The question is," Jake continued, his voice reflecting both curiosity and professional caution, "where does this tunnel lead, and why was it built beneath what was supposed to be an ordinary ranch barn?" Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she contemplated the possibilities. The Donovan family's connections to Colorado's outlaw history were well documented in local historical records, but until this moment, they had existed primarily in the realm of speculation and folklore. The discovery of this tunnel provided physical evidence that the legends might have basis in historical fact. "Only one way to find out," she said, her voice betraying both apprehension and the kind of curiosity that had driven her to purchase the barn in the first place, despite everyone's warnings about the financial risks involved. Jake hesitated, his contractor's instincts warning him about the potential dangers of exploring unknown underground spaces. "We should be extremely careful," he cautioned. "Tunnels this old can be structurally compromised, especially if they've been subjected to groundwater infiltration or seismic movement. The air quality could be problematic, and there might be unstable areas that could collapse without warning." Despite his concerns, Jake's fascination with the historical significance of their discovery was evident. This was exactly the kind of find that made his work in historic preservation genuinely meaningful, the moment when careful restoration revealed secrets that had been hidden for generations, connecting the present directly with pivotal moments in the past. "Let me go first," he said, his professional caution warring with his genuine excitement about exploring what might be one of the most significant historical discoveries in Jefferson County in decades. "I've got more experience with unstable structures, and if there are any problems, I'll be better equipped to recognize them before they become dangerous." Sarah nodded, recognizing both the wisdom of his suggestion and the genuine care he was showing for her safety. Jake's willingness to take risks on behalf of the project had already gone far beyond what she had any right to expect from a contractor, especially one whose payment was far from guaranteed given her precarious financial situation. With careful, deliberate movements, Jake positioned himself at the tunnel entrance, testing each stone step before committing his full weight to it. The steps felt solid beneath his boots, showing no signs of the deterioration or instability that might have developed over nearly 150 years of abandonment. Sarah followed close behind, her flashlight beam joining his to illuminate their descent into what felt like a direct connection to Colorado's frontier past. The air in the tunnel was noticeably cooler than the stifling heat of the storage room. Above, carrying the clean, mineral scent of underground spaces that had been sealed away from surface contamination for generations, the temperature differential created slight air currents that suggested the tunnel system might include ventilation features designed to ensure habitability during extended use. As they moved deeper into the passage, the quality of the construction became even more impressive. The tunnel walls showed evidence of careful planning and execution, with drainage channels carved into the floor to direct water away from the main passage, and strategic placement of support stones to ensure structural stability. This wasn't hasty work done under pressure. It represented a significant investment of time, skill, and resources by people who intended the tunnel to serve important purposes over an extended period. The passage extended approximately 40 feet, gradually sloping downward before opening into what their flashlights revealed to be a surprisingly spacious underground chamber. The room had been carved from the natural granite bedrock, its ceiling supported by a combination of the living rock and carefully positioned timber braces that appeared to be in remarkably good condition despite their age. "This is absolutely incredible," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she tried to process the scope of what they had discovered. The chamber was roughly 20 feet across and perhaps 15 feet deep, large enough to serve as living quarters for several people, if necessary. "Someone created an entire underground room beneath my property, a hidden space that's been waiting here for nearly 150 years. Jake moved carefully around the chamber's perimeter, his flashlight revealing details that spoke to both the practical and defensive purposes the space had been designed to serve. "Look at this construction," he said, his voice filled with professional admiration. Proper ventilation shafts leading up to the surface here and here. He indicated narrow openings that had been carefully concealed above ground. Drainage system to prevent flooding during heavy rains or snowmelt. Storage niches carved directly into the rock walls. This space was designed for long-term occupation by people who needed to remain hidden from outside observation. But it was what stood against the chamber's far wall that truly took their breath away and would soon transform Sarah's desperate gamble into something beyond her wildest dreams. 4 wooden chests of varying sizes sat in a neat row, their surfaces darkened with age, but still structurally intact.
Ow.
The chests appeared to be of different vintages and origins, some showing the rough construction typical of frontier craftsmanship, others displaying the more refined workmanship that suggested they had been acquired from professional furniture makers. That's not just a storage cellar, Jake stated unnecessarily, his voice carrying a mixture of professional admiration and genuine awe as their lights revealed the scope of the construction project that lay hidden beneath the barn floor. That's a deliberate tunnel built with the same attention to detail and structural integrity as the barn itself. Sarah carefully directed her flashlight beam into the opening, trying to gauge the passage's depth and direction. The stone steps appeared to be hand-carved, each one carefully shaped to provide secure footing for someone moving between the barn and whatever lay at the tunnel's destination. The stonework was remarkably well preserved, showing little sign of the moisture damage that had affected the wooden structures above ground. Frontier rear construction, Jake observed, examining the tunnel entrance without actually entering the passage. His experienced eye cataloged the construction techniques and materials that had been used. Hand-cut stone, probably local granite, from the mountain quarries that supplied building material throughout Jefferson County during the territorial period. This kind of work represents months of careful excavation and masonry, definitely not something that was thrown together quickly or casually. The implications of their discovery were beginning to sink in. This wasn't simply an old building with some interesting historical features. They had uncovered evidence of deliberate, sophisticated construction that suggested the Donovan barn had served purposes beyond simple agricultural storage. The tunnel's existence lent credibility to the local legends about Blackjack Donovan's use of the property as a hideout and raised intriguing questions. "The latch isn't locked," she observed, her voice barely above a whisper as she examined the chest's closure mechanism. "It's just held shut by this simple metal clasp." Jake joined her at the chest, both of them understanding that they were about to cross a threshold that would forever change their understanding of the Donovan barn's historical significance. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice reflecting both excitement and the weight of responsibility that came with potentially uncovering artifacts of genuine historical importance. Sarah nodded, her mouth too dry for speech as she reached toward the clasp that had secured the chest's contents for nearly 150 years. With hands that shook slightly from excitement and anticipation, she carefully lifted the metal fastening and slowly raised the chest's heavy wooden lid. The contents that were revealed in the beam of their flashlights would soon make headlines across the country and transform Sarah Mitchell from a desperate single mother facing financial ruin into the guardian of one of the most significant treasure discoveries in American frontier history. But at this moment, as the lid creaked open on its ancient hinges, they could only stare in speechless wonder at what Blackjack Donovan and his brother Thomas had preserved for future generations in the hidden chamber beneath the barn that would soon bear their family name in history books across the nation. Inside the largest wooden chest, protected from moisture and time by the remarkably well-engineered underground chamber, lay treasures that defied Sarah's most optimistic expectations. Stacks of gold coins caught their flashlight beams and threw back glittering reflections that danced across the stone walls like captured sunlight. The coins appeared to be a mixture of different denominations and mint years, surfaces tarnished with age but unmistakably genuine. Nestled alongside the gold were several bars of what appeared to be silver, each one bearing distinctive markings that suggested they had been processed by frontier rear mining operations. But it wasn't just the precious metals that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Bundles of paper currency, protected by oiled cloth wrappings that had preserved them through nearly 150 years of storage, were visible throughout the chest's interior. The bills appeared to be a mixture of territorial notes, bank drafts, and what looked like certificates from various Colorado mining operations, financial instruments that represented the economic complexity of frontier commerce during the 1870s. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the stone chamber's hushed atmosphere. "This is real. This is actually real." Jake leaned closer, his experienced contractor's eye now replaced by the wonder of someone witnessing a moment of genuine historical discovery. "Those gold coins," he said quietly, "they look like they're from the right time period for the Blackjack Donovan legend. And those silver bars, see those markings? Those look like assayer's stamps from the territorial period." As they continued to inventory the chest's contents by flashlight, more details emerged that connected their discovery directly to Colorado's outlaw history. Several of the gold coins bore dates from the late 1860s and early 1870s, precisely the period when Blackjack Donovan's gang had been most active in the territory. The silver bars showed markings that appeared to correspond to mines and processing facilities that had operated in the region during the height of the mining boom. Perhaps most intriguing were the bundles of documents that had been carefully wrapped and stored alongside the precious metals. Sarah could see handwritten pages covered in what appeared to be detailed records, possibly inventories of stolen goods, records of gang activities, or correspondence between Blackjack and his law-abiding brother Thomas. The historical significance of such documents, if they proved authentic, could far exceed even the monetary value of the gold and silver. "We need to look at the other chests," Sarah said, her excitement building as she realized they might have discovered not just a single cache of hidden treasure, but an entire archive of materials related to one of Colorado's most notorious outlaw gangs. If this chest contains this much, what might be in the others? The second chest, slightly smaller but constructed with similar attention to security, contained what appeared to be personal effects and more documents. Sarah could see the glint of what might be jewelry, possibly items taken during robberies, alongside more bundles of papers that could represent correspondence, planning documents, or records of the gang's various criminal enterprises. A quick examination revealed what appeared to be maps, possibly showing hideout locations or planned robbery targets throughout the Colorado territory. The third chest yielded more gold coins, these appearing to be of different denominations, and possibly different origins than those in the first container. Some appeared to be standard U.S. mint issues, while others showed the distinctive characteristics of coins that had been minted in California during the gold rush period. The presence of California gold in a Colorado hideout supported historical accounts of Blackjack Donovan's gang having operated across multiple territories during their criminal career. The fourth and smallest chest contained what appeared to be the most personal items, individual pieces of jewelry that might have been taken during robberies of wealthy travelers, small gold nuggets that suggested direct connections to mining operations, and what looked like official documents that might have been stolen during raids on government facilities or bank robberies. But as Sarah and Jake continued their preliminary examination of the treasure trove, they became aware of sounds from above that suggested their underground exploration was about to be interrupted. The distinctive sound of vehicle doors slamming echoed faintly through the chamber's ventilation system, followed by voices and footsteps that seemed to be approaching the barn's main entrance. "Someone's here," Jake said, his voice carrying immediate concern as he realized their discovery might be about to become far more complicated than either of them had anticipated, and it sounds like more than one person. Sarah felt a surge of panic as the implications hit her. They were underground in a hidden chamber, surrounded by what appeared to be millions of dollars in historical treasure. With no clear plan for how to handle such an extraordinary discovery, the timing of these visitors seemed impossibly coincidental. How could anyone know about their exploration of the storage room, much less their discovery of the hidden tunnel? "We need to get back up there," Sarah said, her mind racing as she tried to process the situation. "But we can't just leave all this exposed. What if whoever's up there has somehow found out about what we discovered?" Jake was already moving toward the tunnel entrance, his contractor's instincts telling him that unexpected visitors to a remote property usually meant some kind of problem. Let's secure what we can quickly and get upstairs to see what's going on. We can come back down once we know who's here and what they want, working with the efficiency that comes from genuine urgency. Sarah and Jake quickly closed the wooden chests and made sure the chamber appeared undisturbed. They couldn't completely conceal their presence. Their footprints in the dust were clearly visible. The chests had obviously been examined, but they could at least avoid having valuable artifacts openly exposed to whoever had arrived above. The climb back up the stone tunnel felt much longer than their descent had. Adrenaline and concern, making every step seem to take forever. As they emerged from the hidden entrance back into the barn's storage room, they could hear voices more clearly. Multiple people were definitely present, and they seemed to be moving through the barn's main areas with the purposeful efficiency of individuals who had specific objectives rather than casual curiosity. Jake quickly repositioned the removable floor section over the tunnel entrance, though he couldn't completely conceal the evidence of their discovery. The disturbed dust patterns and displaced debris made it clear that something significant had happened in this area of the storage room. "Stay calm," Jake whispered as they prepared to leave the storage room and confront whoever had arrived. "We don't know who these people are or what they want. Let's find out what's going on before we make any decisions about what to tell them." As they emerged from the storage room into the barn's main area, Sarah was surprised to see not just random visitors, but Rebecca standing near the front entrance in animated conversation with a man in official-looking clothing who was consulting a clipboard and taking notes. Behind him, Sarah could see a county vehicle parked outside, its official markings clearly visible through the barn's damaged windows.
"There you are," Rebecca called when she spotted them, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and concern. "This is Frank Morrison from the County Building Inspection Office. He says they received a complaint about unauthorized construction work happening on the property." The county inspector, a thin man in his 50s with the officious manner of someone who took his regulatory responsibilities very seriously, looked up from his clipboard with evident skepticism. "Ms. Mitchell, I presume? I'm Frank Morrison, Jefferson County Building Inspector. We've received reports of potential code violations and unauthorized structural work at this address. I need to inspect the premises immediately to determine if any unpermitted construction activities are taking place." Sarah and Jake exchanged glances, both of them struck by the suspicious timing of this official visit. They had been in the storage room for less than an hour, and their discovery of the hidden tunnel had been completely accidental. How could anyone possibly know about their exploration, much less have filed a complaint about construction work that hadn't actually occurred? "I'm not sure what reports you're referring to," Sarah said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system from their underground discovery. "We've been conducting a structural assessment of the building's condition, but no construction work has begun. Mr. Morrison here is my contractor, and he's been helping me evaluate the property's renovation needs." The inspector's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation. "Ma'am, we received a specific complaint about structural modifications being made to the building's interior spaces. The caller mentioned possible excavation, work, and alterations to the building's foundation systems." This information sent a chill through Sarah's entire body. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Someone had known about their exploration of the storage room and had contacted county authorities within minutes of their discovery. But how was that possible? Who could have been watching them? And why would they want to involve government officials in what should have been a private property matter? Through the barn's front windows, Sarah noticed a dark pickup truck parked across the road, its occupant apparently watching their property with obvious interest. The vehicle hadn't been there when they had arrived that morning, and its strategic positioning suggested surveillance rather than casual observation. "How could anyone possibly know what we were doing in here?" Sarah whispered to Jake, her voice barely audible. "We only discovered that tunnel 20 minutes ago." Jake's expression was grim as he considered the implications. "Historic properties like this one attract attention from lots of different groups," he replied quietly. "Treasure hunters, archaeological enthusiasts, people who've been researching the Blackjack Donovan legends for years. If word has somehow gotten out that you've purchased the property and are conducting serious renovation work, there might be people who have been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Before they could discuss the situation further, the sound of additional vehicles arriving drew their attention back to the barn's entrance. Sarah watched in growing amazement as two more official-looking cars pulled up outside the property, their occupants emerging with the purposeful movements of people who had urgent business to conduct. The first newcomer was a middle-aged woman in a professional business suit, carrying a leather portfolio and moving with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to taking charge of complicated situations. Behind her came an older gentleman, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful demeanor of an academic, his clothing and bearing suggesting university affiliation rather than government service. "Ms. Mitchell?" the woman called as she approached the barn's entrance, her voice carrying both authority and urgency. "I'm Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the Colorado State Historical Preservation Office. This is Professor David Chen from Colorado University's History Department. We need to speak with you immediately about what you've discovered on your property." The summer heat seemed to press against the barn's walls with increasing intensity, but for Sarah, the real pressure was just beginning. The casual property assessment that had started her morning had somehow transformed into a situation involving multiple government officials who seemed to know more about her activities than should have been possible. "May we come in?" Dr. Walsh asked, though her tone suggested it wasn't really a question that would accept a negative answer. "What we need to discuss is both urgent and of potentially significant historical importance to the state of Colorado." Sarah hesitated, only briefly before nodding her agreement. The situation had clearly moved beyond her control, and refusing to cooperate with state officials would likely create more problems than it solved. "Of course, though, I should warn you that the building is in considerable disrepair. We're still in the very early stages of assessing what restoration work might be possible." The officials entered the barn, their experienced eyes immediately cataloging the building's deteriorated condition, while also scanning for evidence of the discovery that had somehow triggered their visit. Dr. Walsh moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had investigated numerous historical sites, while Professor Chen's academic demeanor suggested familiarity with archaeological investigations and artifact recovery situations. "This is Jake Morrison, the contractor who's been helping me evaluate the property's condition," Sarah explained, gesturing toward Jake, who was watching the proceedings with careful neutrality. "And this is Rebecca Torres, a friend who's been assisting with the assessment." Professor Chen, a distinguished man in his 60s with the scholarly bearing of someone who had spent decades researching Colorado's territorial history, spoke up with obvious excitement barely contained beneath his professional demeanor. "Ms. Mitchell, we have substantial reason to believe that you've uncovered historically significant artifacts on this property, potentially including materials related to the infamous outlaw Blackjack Donovan and his gang's activities during the 1870s. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized that these officials somehow knew about their underground discovery, despite the fact that she and Jake had told no one about finding the hidden tunnel and treasure chamber. The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because official recognition might legitimize and protect their discovery, but terrifying because it suggested a level of outside interest and surveillance that she hadn't anticipated. "A hidden tunnel," she said quietly, deciding that honesty was probably her best strategy, given that these officials clearly already knew more than they should have. "Leading to an underground chamber that appears to have been constructed during the frontier period?" Dr. Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly, though her expression suggested she might have been expecting exactly this kind of confirmation. "Yes. Historical records indicate that Blackjack Donovan and his brother Thomas constructed several hidden chambers and tunnels throughout this region after the Great Mint robbery of 1873. The stolen treasure, estimated at over $75,000 in gold and silver coins, approximately $2 million in today's currency, disappeared completely after the gang was ambushed by territorial law enforcement near Denver. Jake stepped forward, his knowledge of local construction, history adding credibility to their account. "The tunnel and chamber show frontier-era construction techniques," he said. "Hand-cut stone, local granite, mortise, and tenon joinery that matches the original barn construction. This isn't recent work. It's definitely from the same period as the building itself." Professor Chen nodded with obvious academic excitement. "You know your local architectural history, Mr. Morrison. What most people don't realize is that Blackjack Donovan specifically chose his brother's property as a secure repository for the most valuable items taken during his gang's various robberies. Items that were too distinctive to sell immediately, but too valuable to abandon permanently." Sarah processed this information, connecting it to their recent discovery of the treasure-filled chests. "The wooden containers we found," she said carefully. "They contained gold coins, silver bars, and what appeared to be documents from the territorial period." "Precisely," Professor Chen confirmed with barely contained excitement. "Blackjack and Thomas Donovan created multiple secure hiding places throughout Jefferson County, away from the scrutiny of territorial law enforcement and rival criminal gangs. They intended to retrieve these valuables after the immediate danger had passed, but Blackjack was killed in a shootout with a sheriff's posse in Wyoming, and Thomas died of tuberculosis before he could recover or reveal the locations of the hidden treasure caches." Dr. Walsh stepped forward, her expression shifting to the serious demeanor of someone about to discuss significant legal and procedural matters. "Ms. Mitchell, those artifacts, if they prove to be authentic materials from the Donovan gang, represent an extraordinary historical discovery. Their academic and cultural value extends far beyond any monetary worth, and their preservation and proper interpretation could completely revise our understanding of that crucial period in Colorado's territorial development."
Sarah felt a defensive instinct rising as she sensed the conversation moving toward questions about her legal rights to the treasure she had discovered on her own property. "I understand the historical significance," she said carefully, "but the Donovan barn is my property. I purchased it legally at a sheriff's auction, and the contents were included in that sale." "Of course," Dr. Walsh acknowledged smoothly, her diplomatic training evident in her approach to what was clearly a delicate situation. "We're absolutely not here to challenge your property rights or make any claims on your discovery. However, given the potential historical importance of these materials, we'd like to propose a cooperative arrangement that would benefit both historical preservation and your personal situation." The tension in the barn's dusty interior was becoming palpable, broken only by Rebecca's practical intervention. "Perhaps we should move this discussion to an area where we can all sit down comfortably," she suggested, indicating a section of the barn where some old wooden crates could serve as makeshift seating. "It's the only part of the building that doesn't have active roof leaks." This sensible suggestion was gratefully accepted, and the group relocated to a slightly less deteriorated area of the barn. Despite the water stains on the walls and the obvious signs of structural problems throughout the building, this corner retains some traces of the barn's former character. With vintage farming tools still visible on the walls and enough space for everyone to gather without crowding. Once everyone was settled, Professor Chen continued with obvious academic enthusiasm that barely masked his excitement about the potential significance of Sarah's discovery. The Blackjack Donovan treasure has been something of a holy grail for Western historians and archaeologists for nearly 150 years. References in contemporary newspaper accounts, sheriff's reports, and territorial government documents confirm its existence. But its location has remained one of the great unsolved mysteries of Colorado's frontier period. Sarah found herself drawn into the historical narrative despite her concerns about the legal and financial implications of her discovery. "We found what appeared to be personal documents in the chests," she said. "Papers that might be correspondence or records of some kind. Those could be absolutely invaluable," Professor Chen replied, his scholarly excitement evident. Contemporary documentation from criminal organizations of that period is extremely rare. Most outlaw gangs didn't keep detailed records for obvious reasons, but the Donovan brothers were known to be more sophisticated in their operations than typical frontier criminals. Dr. Walsh leaned forward, her expression becoming more businesslike as the conversation shifted toward practical considerations. Ms. Mitchell, the Colorado State Historical Preservation Office, would like to propose a partnership arrangement. We can provide immediate assistance with your building's structural problems engineering support, preservation specialists, renovation grants, and access to resources that would normally be far beyond what any individual property owner could afford. The offer was tempting, particularly given Sarah's limited financial resources and the barn's extensive renovation needs. The structural problems Jake had identified would require tens of thousands of dollars to address properly, money that Sarah simply didn't have access to. But she sensed that Dr. Walsh's proposal would come with significant strings attached. In exchange for what? Sarah asked directly. Her experience with her divorce proceedings having taught her to be skeptical of arrangements that seemed good to be true. In exchange for your cooperation in allowing our experts to properly examine, document, and authenticate the artifacts you've discovered, Dr. Walsh explained, no removal of materials from the property without your explicit consent and proper legal documentation. Your rights as the property owner would be completely respected throughout the entire process. The arrangement sounded reasonable in principle, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there were aspects of the situation that she didn't fully understand. The timing of these officials' arrival, their detailed knowledge of her discovery, and the apparent surveillance of her property all suggested a level of outside interest that went beyond normal historical preservation activities. Why the urgency? She asked pointedly. These artifacts have been hidden underground for nearly 150 years. What's changed that makes immediate action necessary? Professor Chin's expression became more serious as he addressed her question. Two primary factors, Ms. Mitchell. First, proper conservation of historical artifacts is extremely time-sensitive. Once they've been disturbed from stable environmental conditions, exposure to temperature fluctuations, humidity changes, and air, circulation can cause rapid deterioration of materials that have survived intact for generations. He paused, glancing at Dr. Walsh before continuing. Second, word has already begun to circulate within historical and archaeological circles about a significant frontier discovery in Jefferson County. We've received inquiries from treasure hunters, private collectors, and even some individuals whose interest in acquiring these materials might not be entirely legal or ethical. This information explained the surveillance vehicle Sarah had noticed and suggested that her discovery was already attracting attention from sources that might not have her best interests in mind. The prospect of dealing with treasure hunters or unscrupulous collectors added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. From outside the barn came Sarah felt a defensive instinct rising as she sensed the conversation moving toward questions about her legal rights to the treasure she had discovered on her own property. I understand the historical significance, she said carefully, but the Donovan barn is my property. I purchased it legally at a sheriff's auction, and the contents were included in that sale. Of course, Dr. Walsh acknowledged smoothly, her diplomatic training evident in her approach to what was clearly a delicate situation. We're absolutely not here to challenge your property rights or make any claims on your discovery. However, given the potential historical importance of these materials, we'd like to propose a cooperative arrangement that would benefit both historical preservation and your personal situation. The tension in the barn's dusty interior was becoming palpable, broken only by Rebecca's practical intervention. Perhaps we should move this discussion to an area where we can all sit down comfortably, she suggested, indicating a section of the barn where some old wooden crates could serve as makeshift seating. It's the only part of the building that doesn't have active roof leaks. This sensible suggestion was gratefully accepted, and the group relocated to a slightly less deteriorated area of the barn. Despite the water stains on the walls and the obvious signs of structural problems throughout the building, this corner retains some traces of the barn's former character. With vintage farming tools still visible on the walls and enough space for everyone to gather without crowding, Once everyone was settled, Professor Chen continued with obvious academic enthusiasm that barely masked his excitement about the potential significance of Sarah's discovery. The Blackjack Donovan treasure has been something of a holy grail for Western historians and archaeologists for nearly 150 years. References in contemporary newspaper accounts, sheriff's reports, and territorial government documents confirm its existence. But its location has remained one of the great unsolved mysteries of Colorado's frontier period. Sarah found herself drawn into the historical narrative despite her concerns about the legal and financial implications of her discovery. "We found what appeared to be personal documents in the chests," she said. "Papers that might be correspondence or records of some kind. Those could be absolutely invaluable," Professor Chen replied, his scholarly excitement evident. Contemporary documentation from criminal organizations of that period is extremely rare. Most outlaw gangs didn't keep detailed records for obvious reasons, but the Donovan brothers were known to be more sophisticated in their operations than typical frontier criminals. Dr. Walsh leaned forward, her expression becoming more businesslike as the conversation shifted toward practical considerations. "Ms. Mitchell, the Colorado State Historical Preservation Office would like to propose a partnership arrangement. We can provide immediate assistance with your building's structural problems engineering support, preservation specialists, renovation grants, and access to resources that would normally be far beyond what any individual property owner could afford." The offer was tempting, particularly given Sarah's limited financial resources and the barn's extensive renovation needs. The structural problems Jake had identified would require tens of thousands of dollars to address properly, money that Sarah simply didn't have access to. But she sensed that Dr. Walsh's proposal, 6 months after the discovery that had transformed her life from desperate struggle to extraordinary opportunity. Sarah Mitchell stood in her restored office, overlooking the bustling activity of what was now officially known as the Donovan Heritage Center. Through windows that had been meticulously reconstructed using historically accurate techniques and materials, she watched as a group of fourth-grade students from Denver gathered around interactive exhibits that brought Colorado's frontier history to life. Their excited voices carried clearly across the carefully landscaped grounds where interpretive trails now guided visitors through the story of territorial outlaws, law enforcement, and the complex social dynamics that had shaped the American West. The transformation had exceeded every expectation Sarah had dared to harbor during those first terrifying days when county inspectors and state officials had descended upon her crumbling barn. What had begun as her last-ditch attempt to avoid homelessness had evolved into one of Colorado's most significant historical preservation success stories, attracting visitors from across the nation and generating the kind of academic interest that elevated regional history to national prominence. The authentication process for the Blackjack Donovan treasure had taken 3 months of meticulous work by teams of historians, archaeologists, and conservation specialists. Every coin had been cataloged, photographed, and compared against known examples from territorial mints. Every document had been subjected to forensic analysis that confirmed both its age and authenticity. The silver bars had been traced to specific mining operations that had been active during the 1870s, while the personal effects had been cross-referenced against contemporary accounts of the Donovan gang's criminal activities. The results had been even more remarkable than Professor Chen's initial optimistic assessments had suggested. The treasure represented not just the proceeds from the famous Great Mint robbery of 1873, but materials from multiple criminal enterprises that had operated throughout Colorado territory during the peak years of frontier lawlessness. More importantly, the documents found alongside the precious metals had provided historians with unprecedented insights into the organization and methods of territorial criminal networks. "The morning tour groups are starting to arrive," announced Rebecca Torres, entering Sarah's office with the efficient energy that had made her invaluable as the center's operations director. Her transformation from supportive friend to professional colleague had been one of the unexpected benefits of the project's success. Rebecca's background in communications and her practical approach to problem-solving had proven perfectly suited to managing the complex logistics of operating a major historical attraction. Sarah smiled as she watched the first chartered bus, of the day disgorge its passengers and the visitor. Parking area that had been constructed where the barn's original coral had once stood. The parking facility had been designed to blend seamlessly with the historical landscape, using materials and construction techniques that complemented rather than competed with the restored 1870s architecture. The reservation system shows were completely booked through October, Rebecca continued, consulting the tablet that had become her constant companion. And the Smithsonian confirmed that their traveling exhibition will open here next spring. Apparently, our discovery has become a centerpiece of their new program on frontier crime and law enforcement. The Smithsonian's interest had been one of several validation points that had elevated the Donovan Heritage Center from regional attraction to national significance. The institution's decision to feature Sarah's discovery in a major traveling exhibition had brought additional resources and credibility that continued to attract scholarly attention and tourist interest from across the country. Dr. Jennifer Walsh appeared in the office doorway, carrying the leather portfolio that had become familiar during the months of collaboration that had transformed the barn from crumbling ruin to world-class historical center. Her role had evolved from state preservation officer to project coordinator for what had become one of Colorado's most ambitious historical restoration initiatives. The governor's office just confirmed, Dr. Walsh announced with obvious satisfaction. The state legislature has approved the additional funding for the research wing expansion. Construction can begin next month, assuming the environmental impact assessments come back clean. This news represented another milestone in the center's rapid development. What had started as a simple agreement to preserve and display the Donovan treasure had expanded into a comprehensive research facility that was attracting graduate students, visiting scholars, and academic conferences from institutions across the American West. The planned expansion would double the center's capacity and establish it as the premier location for studying frontier-era criminal justice and territorial governance. Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Just 18 months earlier, she had been facing eviction from a small apartment, unemployed and desperate. Watching her daughter Emma struggle 6 months after the discovery that had transformed her life from desperate struggle to extraordinary opportunity, Sarah Mitchell stood in her restored office, overlooking the bustling activity of what was now officially known as the Donovan Heritage Center. Through windows that had been meticulously reconstructed using historically accurate techniques and materials, she watched as a group of fourth-grade students from Denver gathered around interactive exhibits that brought Colorado's frontier history to life. Their excited voices carried clearly across the carefully landscaped grounds where interpretive trails now guided visitors through the story of territorial outlaws, law enforcement, and the complex social dynamics that had shaped the American West. The transformation had exceeded every expectation Sarah had dared to harbor during those first terrifying days when county inspectors and state officials had descended upon her crumbling barn. What had begun as her last-ditch attempt to avoid homelessness had evolved into one of Colorado's most significant historical preservation success stories, attracting visitors from across the nation and generating the kind of academic interest that elevated regional history to national prominence. The authentication process for the Blackjack Donovan treasure had taken 3 months of meticulous work by teams of historians, archaeologists, and conservation specialists. Every coin had been cataloged, photographed, and compared against known examples from territorial mints. Every document had been subjected to forensic analysis that confirmed both its age and authenticity. The silver bars had been traced to specific mining operations that had been active during the 1870s, while the personal effects had been cross-referenced against contemporary accounts of the Donovan gang's criminal activities. The results had been even more remarkable than Professor Chen's initial optimistic assessments had suggested. The treasure represented not just the proceeds from the famous Great Mint robbery of 1873, but materials from multiple criminal enterprises that had operated throughout Colorado territory during the peak years of frontier lawlessness. More importantly, the documents found alongside the precious metals had provided historians with unprecedented insights into the organization and methods of territorial criminal networks. "The morning tour groups are starting to arrive," announced Rebecca Torres, entering Sarah's office with the efficient energy that had made her invaluable as the center's operations director. Her transformation from supportive friend to professional colleague had been one of the unexpected benefits of the project's success. Rebecca's background in communications and her practical approach to problem-solving had proven perfectly suited to managing the complex logistics of operating a major historical attraction. Sarah smiled as she watched the first chartered bus of the day disgorge its passengers in the visitor parking area that had been constructed where the barn's original corral had once stood. The parking facility had been designed to blend seamlessly with the historical landscape, using materials and construction techniques that complemented rather than competed with the restored 1870s architecture. The reservation system shows we're completely booked through October, Rebecca continued, consulting the tablet that had become her constant companion. And the Smithsonian confirmed that their traveling exhibition will open here next spring. Apparently, our discovery has become We can arrange the filming for Tuesday morning, Sarah decided, mentally reviewing the center's complex scheduling requirements. That's between tour groups, and the archaeological team will be working in the research lab rather than the tunnel area. The ongoing archaeological work had revealed that the Donovan brothers' hidden chamber was even more significant than their initial discovery had suggested. Ground-penetrating radar had located 2 additional chambers connected to the main tunnel system, suggesting that the property had served as the central hub for a network of hideouts that extended throughout Jefferson County. Each new discovery had added layers of complexity to the historical narrative while generating additional academic interest in media coverage. Professor David Chen entered the office, carrying the academic journals and research materials that reflected his ongoing scholarly work on the Donovan discovery. His initial excitement about the historical significance of Sarah's find had evolved into serious academic research that was reshaping historians' understanding of frontier criminal organizations and territorial law enforcement. The peer review process is complete, Professor Chen announced with obvious satisfaction. The Journal of Western History has accepted our paper on the Donovan documents for their special issue on frontier crime. This will be the definitive academic treatment of your discovery, Sarah. It confirms that the materials you found represent the most significant cache of outlaw-related artifacts ever discovered in the American West. This academic validation had been crucial for establishing the center's credibility within scholarly circles. Professor Chen's research, based on months of detailed analysis of the documents found alongside the treasure, had revealed previously unknown aspects of how criminal networks had operated during Colorado's territorial period. The findings had implications that extended far beyond regional history, contributing to broader understanding of how frontier societies had dealt with lawlessness and the development of formal justice systems. Speaking of academic recognition, Dr. Walsh interjected, the National Trust for Historic Preservation wants to present you with their Outstanding Achievement Award at the annual conference in Washington next month. The citation specifically mentions how your discovery has demonstrated the potential for individual property owners to make significant contributions to national historical understanding. Sarah felt a familiar sense of unreality as she contemplated the recognition that continued to arrive from increasingly prestigious sources. The woman who had once been facing homelessness was now being honored by national organizations for contributions to American historical scholarship. The transformation was so complete that she sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life. But it was the human element of her story that continued to resonate most powerfully with visitors to the center. The exhibits didn't just display blackjack, Donovan's treasure, and tell the story of frontier outlaws. They also chronicled Sarah's journey from financial desperation to historical preservation, demonstrating how ordinary people could stumble upon extraordinary discoveries that connected past and present in unexpected ways. The school group from Kansas City is here, Rebecca announced, checking the visitor management system on her tablet. 43 students, plus teachers and chaperones. They're specifically interested in the connection between the Donovan gangs, activities, and the development of law enforcement in the territories. The educational programs had become one of the center's most successful features, attracting school groups from across the region who came to experience frontier history through interactive exhibits and hands-on activities. Students could examine Replicas of the treasure artifacts. Explore a carefully reconstructed version of the underground tunnel system. Participate in role-playing exercises that help them understand the complex social dynamics of territorial Colorado. Sarah made her way downstairs to the main exhibition hall, where the restored barn's interior now showcased the Donovan treasure, alongside carefully constructed displays that placed the discovery within its proper historical context. The original wooden chests sat in climate-controlled cases, their contents arranged to allow visitors to appreciate both the magnitude of the treasure and its historical significance. Interactive displays allowed visitors to handle replica coins and documents while learning about frontier commerce, criminal justice, and the economic factors that had motivated territorial outlaws. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a detailed recreation of the underground chamber where the treasure had been hidden for nearly 150 years. Visitors could walk through a carefully constructed replica of the tunnel system, experiencing the same sense of discovery that Sarah and Jake had felt during that transformative morning when they had first pried up the storage room floorboards. But the exhibition also told Sarah's personal story, acknowledging that historical discoveries often resulted from the sexy intersection of individual circumstances with larger historical forces. A display case near the exhibition entrance contained the crowbar that Jake had used to open the tunnel entrance, accompanied by a simple plaque that read, "Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when ordinary people refuse to give up." Hope. As Sarah watched the Kansas City students experience the center's exhibits with obvious enthusiasm and engagement, she reflected on how completely her understanding of value and opportunity had been transformed. The barn that had represented her last financial hope had indeed provided the security she had desperately sought, but not in any way she could have anticipated. "We can arrange the filming for Tuesday morning," Sarah decided, mentally reviewing the center's complex scheduling requirements. "That's between tour groups, and the archaeological team will be working in the research lab rather than the tunnel area." The ongoing archaeological work had revealed that the Donovan brothers' hidden chamber was even more significant than their initial discovery had suggested. Ground-penetrating radar had located 2 additional chambers connected to the main tunnel system, suggesting that the property had served as the central hub for a network of hideouts that extended throughout Jefferson County. Each new discovery had added layers of complexity to the historical narrative while generating additional academic interest in media coverage. Professor David Chen entered the office, carrying the academic journals and research materials that reflected his ongoing scholarly work on the Donovan discovery. His initial excitement about the historical significance of Sarah's find had evolved into serious academic research that was reshaping historians' understanding of frontier criminal organizations and territorial law enforcement. "The peer review process is complete," Professor Chen announced with obvious satisfaction. "The Journal of Western History has accepted our paper on the Donovan documents for their special issue on frontier crime. This will be the definitive academic treatment of your discovery, Sarah. It confirms that the materials you found represent the most significant cache of outlaw-related artifacts ever discovered in the American West. This academic validation had been crucial for establishing the center's credibility within scholarly circles." Professor Chen's research, based on months of detailed analysis of the documents found alongside the treasure, had revealed previously unknown aspects of how criminal networks had operated during Colorado's territorial period. The findings had implications that extended far beyond regional history, contributing to broader understanding of how frontier societies had dealt with lawlessness and the development of formal justice systems. Speaking of academic recognition, Dr. Walsh interjected, "The National Trust for Historic Preservation wants to present you with their Outstanding Achievement Award at the annual conference in Washington next month." The citation specifically mentions how your discovery has demonstrated the potential for individual property owners to make significant contributions to national historical understanding. Sarah felt a familiar sense of unreality as she contemplated the recognition that continued to arrive from increasingly prestigious sources. The woman who had once been facing homelessness was now being honored by national organizations for contributions to American historical scholarship. The transformation was so complete that she sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life. But it was the human element of her story that continued to resonate most powerfully with visitors to the Center. The exhibits didn't just display blackjack, Donovan's treasure, and tell the story of frontier outlaws. They also chronicled Sarah's journey from financial desperation to historical preservation, demonstrating how ordinary people could stumble upon extraordinary discoveries that connected past and present in unexpected ways. The school group from Kansas City is here, Rebecca announced, checking the visit. This news represented another potential milestone in the center's development. National Historic Landmark status would place the Donovan Heritage Center in the same category as locations like Independence Hall and the Statue of Liberty sites, recognized as having exceptional significance to American history and culture. It would also mean additional responsibilities, Sarah noted. Her experience managing the center, having taught her to consider both the benefits and obligations that came with increased recognition or oversight, more complex preservation, requirements, probably more media attention, and visitor expectations. Jake nodded, his own experience with the center's rapid growth having given him similar perspective on the challenges that accompanied success. But it would also ensure the center's long-term security and provide resources for expansion, might not be available through other funding sources. As they discussed the various opportunities and challenges facing the center, Sarah found herself thinking about the broader implications of her discovery and its aftermath. The Donovan treasure had provided the foundation for a successful institution, but the center's real value lay in its ability to connect visitors with the human stories behind historical events. People came to see outlaw gold and frontier artifacts, but they left with understanding about the complex motivations and difficult choices that had shaped Colorado's territorial development. The center also served as proof that historical preservation could be economically viable and culturally significant simultaneously. The project had created jobs, attracted tourism revenue, and generated tax income for Jefferson County, while also advancing scholarly understanding of frontier history and providing educational opportunities for thousands of students annually. You know, Jake said, his voice carrying the comfortable intimacy that had developed during their months of collaboration. When I first told you this barn might be too far gone to save, I was thinking purely in terms of structural engineering and construction costs. Sarah smiled, remembering that initial assessment and how completely it had missed the possibilities that lay hidden beneath the storage room floor. Desperation has its advantages, she replied, echoing a phrase that had become something of a motto during the center's development. When conventional solutions aren't available, you become willing to consider options that might seem impossible under normal circumstances. The evening concluded with a review of the center's upcoming schedule, which included a conference on frontier archaeology, a visit from documentary filmmakers working on a series about American treasure discoveries, and the installation of new exhibits that would expand the center's coverage of territorial law enforcement and criminal justice. Each event represented another opportunity to share the story of how individual determination and historical preservation could combine to create something far more valuable than either could achieve independently. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she walked through the cottage rooms that had become home for her and Emma. The furnishings were a mixture of carefully restored antiques and comfortable modern pieces, creating an environment that honored the past while serving the practical needs of contemporary life. Family photographs on the mantelpiece showed Emma's school activities and Sarah's professional achievements, documenting their transformation from financial crisis to stability and purpose. Before turning off the lights, Sarah stepped outside to look at the barn that had changed everything. The building stood illuminated against the Colorado night sky, its restored exterior showing no trace of the decay and neglect that had characterized it when she had first seen it at the sheriff's auction. Visitors driving past on the county road would see an impressive historical facility that suggested permanence and success, with no hint of the desperate circumstances that had made its restoration possible. But Sarah knew the complete story: the foreclosure notices, the eviction deadline, the terrifying sense that she was failing her daughter and herself. She remembered the weight of that final $2,200 in her hands, the crowbar splitting apart rotting floorboards, the moment when Jake's flashlight had first revealed the stone steps leading down to secrets that had been waiting nearly 150 years. For discovery, the Donovan Heritage Center stood as testament to multiple forms of courage: the frontier, courage of brothers who had risked everything to preserve what they valued most, and the contemporary courage of a single mother who had refused to accept defeat when conventional solutions had been exhausted. Both stories demonstrated that the most important discoveries often happened when people were pushed beyond their comfort zones and forced to explore territories they would never have entered by choice. A year and a half after that transformative morning when she had pried up the storage room floorboards with borrowed tools and desperate hope, Sarah Mitchell had become living proof that apparent endings could conceal extraordinary new beginnings. The failing barn that had represented her last chance at financial stability had revealed itself to be something far more valuable: a bridge between past and present, a catalyst for historical understanding, and the foundation for a future that honored both personal resilience and cultural preservation. As she returned to the cottage where Emma slept peacefully in the security that their discovery had made possible, Sarah reflected on the words that had become the center's unofficial motto. Inscribed on a small plaque near the exhibition entrance: "Fortune favors the bold, but loyalty outlasts gold. Preserve well what matters most." No, the Donovan brothers had preserved treasure that waited nearly 150 years for discovery. Sarah had preserved hope when abandoning it would have been easier and more logical. Both acts of preservation had created possibilities that extended far beyond their originators' lifetimes, connecting past courage with present opportunity in ways that honored both individual determination and collective memory. The story that had begun with a desperate single mother facing homelessness had become a narrative about the power of historical preservation to transform both individual lives and community understanding. The crumbling barn purchased with her last dollars had become a beacon of historical significance that attracted visitors from around the world while providing the security and purpose that Sarah had been desperately seeking. But perhaps most importantly, the Donovan Heritage Center served as proof that ordinary people, facing extraordinary circumstances, could make discoveries and preservation choices that enriched the broader human story. Sarah's journey from financial ruin to historical stewardship demonstrated that the courage required for survival and the courage required for preservation often drew from the same deep wells of human determination. And that sometimes, when we think we're fighting for our last chance, we're actually fighting for opportunities we never dared to imagine. The morning would bring new visitors eager to learn about outlaw treasure and frontier history. But they would also encounter a more contemporary story about the power of perseverance and the extraordinary possibilities that could emerge from even the most desperate circumstances. In preserving Black Jack Donovan's legacy, Sarah Mitchell had secured her own end in the process. She had created something that would inspire others long after her own story had become part of the historical record she had helped to preserve. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.